Welcome back to Sociology 227. This is Sara Ahmed, video 1. In this video I've got 3 tasks. The first is to introduce you to Sara Ahmed. Next, I want to look to the phenomenological tradition in sociology and philosophy. And finally, I want to explore how Sara Ahmed is trying to invert that tradition by looking to racialization and to queer desire. This will get you ready to do the readings. Let's do it. Sara Ahmed was most recently Professor of Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London, where she recently quit over departmental and institutional handlings of sexual harassment. She also has a blog, Feminist Killjoys. She started the blog while writing her most recent book and is compiling data on institutional complaints, such as those she quit over, in the university setting. So, in her words, she no longer works in the university, but she still works on the university, on how institutions address matters that challenge the status quo. Thus, her approach to being a feminist killjoy. One is a killjoy when one doesn't play along with a joke that offends them, just as one is a killjoy in an institution when they obstruct the business-as-usual operation within it. Again, I should emphasize that Ahmed is not a sociologist, but the themes of her work stretch throughout the stuff we've looked through in this course and earlier in SOCY 226. Here, I'll focus on her book, Queer Phenomenology. The whiteness piece assigned today is part of that greater project. First, what do we mean by phenomenology? Let's look to the root words here. When we talk about something being phenomenal, we mean it is an object of experience. And the word logos refers to reason or study. So while sociology means the study of the social, phenomenology means the study of experience. We are going to do both of these things together. Altogether, we have an interpretive framework for understanding experience. Ahmed's phenomenological goal is exploring how institutions produce racial categories and how those institutions alter the experience of racialized bodies. This is a queering of the phenomenological project, which tends to explore individual experience. I'll explore the phenomenological tradition generally before returning to Ahmed's work and the stuff she's doing in the reading. To sketch the tradition, I want to look to 3 different phenomenologists. The first is the founder of phenomenology, Edmund Husserl. Husserl's goal was a comprehensive science of experience from the first-person perspective. Husserl was interested in the ways in which we grasp the meanings of particular entities. He's interested in how we explore things, whether they are real or not, as objects of consciousness. I think Husserl's best book is The Crisis of European Sciences and Transcendental Phenomenology. Husserl argues that the pre-given entities of scientific knowledge that we take for granted were arrived at in terms of our common measurement of the world around us. This argument isn't to discredit scientific knowledge, but rather it is one that claims that all knowledge was first arrived at within the fallible social world. The claim is that scientific categories are objects of collective experience. We arrive at them collectively before they become self-evident. Abstract, I know. Let me give you 2 examples. First, my German friend, Oliver. I asked Oliver how tall he was. 195 centimeters, he said. His wife, Anna, and I looked very puzzled at one another. Part of the German life world is the metric system applied to height, unlike in North America. Or consider my other friend Anthony, who moved to Canada from Miami. He'd post the temperature on Facebook, complaining to all his friends in Florida how cold it was here. But I had no idea what the numbers meant in Fahrenheit. He wasn't even good at taking his coat off and giving it to you with the mitts and toque in the sleeve. I had to tell him about this. Like Oliver's height, his temperature in Fahrenheit is foreign to me, as are my winter techniques foreign to him. We don't know these things explicitly because we don't live in the same social world. I use these examples to show that we find meaning first in collective life, only later in objective properties of heat or of height. So the focus isn't on whether or not heat or height are real, but about how we make these categories meaningful. Here we find Husserl's 2 most important concepts. The first is the life world, the common, taken for granted world of shared meaning. For Husserl, when we engage the world in our everyday lives, we do it through a common sense structure. This is what makes culture what it is. A common set of things used as a background for our practices. A common know-how. Sociologists are interested in how everyday action is shaped by this common knowledge structure. Thus, we can pursue a sociology not just of moral attachments, think about Durkheim, but mental attachments of meaning. That's the life world. Next, intersubjectivity. When Husserl talks about intersubjectivity, he is interested in the subject as part of a social group. We've already talked a bit about this. Recall Marx's interest in how labor creates subjects. Foucault on how knowledge practices create subjects. Butler on gender. Husserl is interested in the structures of meaning that are shared between subjects in the common world. How there are meaningful backgrounds shared between us for common life, just like in the case of a scientific community. For us, this means a sociology of the meanings that we make together. Two definitions. The life world, the common sense meaning that we make together, applied in our daily lives. Then, intersubjectivity, the way that we make meaning and knowledge together. So when sociologists read Husserl, they think about collective meaning and how we make it together. Next, I want to turn to Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who focuses on the body and embodiment. Merleau-Ponty was an important French philosopher whose famous Phenomenology of Perception shows the active role our body plays in making meaning. Merleau-Ponty spends that long book exploring the way that, in perception, we are always dwelling through our body, making the world into a coherent whole. In the case of both visual perception and sexual desire, the body serves to integrate various disparate experiences and sensations into a coherent whole. When we think about how we make meaning, we first have to look to the body, our window into experience. In this and the following videos, I want to show how people like Sara Ahmed have incorporated Merleau-Ponty in their work to talk about embodied differences. You know, race, gender, queer existence, all that. So the key concepts here are embodiment, how our bodies play an active role in constituting objects of lived experience, and intercorporeality, how social order is always explored through the body, and how we dwell in the world alongside others similarly embodied. Ahmed is going to take this way of dwelling in a body as part of her queer phenomenology, looking at race, racialization, and the sociology of desire. If you like old dead white dudes, then phenomenology is probably the philosophical approach for you. Instead of talking about more of them, I want to talk about how we can incorporate phenomenology into the sociology of sex, gender, queer theory, etc. To do so, let's look to Iris Marion Young's classic paper, Throwing Like a Girl. As I said, there are a lot of old, dead, white dude phenomenologists. But there is another tradition of feminist phenomenology, made most famous by Simone de Beauvoir. I think the best essay in phenomenological philosophy, feminist or otherwise, is I.M. Young's Throwing Like a Girl, a phenomenology of feminine body comportment, motility, and spatiality, which extends the phenomenological work that Merleau-Ponty did alongside the feminist phenomenological approach. In that paper, Young, who you see here, explores how gendered norms become embodied. In the Phenomenology of Perception, Merleau-Ponty explores how we gain an action space within which we body forth in the world. We are able, intuitively, to know whether something is within or outside of our reach without an objective calculation of distance. This enables us to take steps, flip light switches, etc. This is done in an unthinking manner. In fact, thinking about the particular mechanism makes the task more difficult to do. This is precisely what I.M. Young is addressing in her piece. In sexist societies like ours, she argues, women are taught to be constantly mindful of the ways their bodies are made to appear while performing particular tasks. This disrupts, she argues, the intentional arc that Merleau-Ponty explored in the Phenomenology of Perception. He looked to limit cases where people had their bodies injured in the First World War to make his case. whereas she looks to those who are made mindful of how women can and should act. In a sexist society like ours, women are forced to reconcile both the lived and object bodies at the same time. In Throwing Like a Girl, Young not only extends the way of thinking about our embodied differences to include gender, but also asks which acts count as gendered. For Young, oppression is not simply making less money than another gender, or is it simply exclusion from playing particular types of games? We feel oppression in our bones. Oppression is embodied, and women experience embodied oppression in sexist societies like ours. I know that's a lot of philosophy, but let's look back to the basics of the phenomenological approach before moving on. Here are 4 things we need to think about when doing phenomenology and sociology together, studying collective experience. They are: meaning. The point is to look at how we make shared meaning in the world. Body. To be in the world is to dwell meaningfully in a body. But of what kind? Space and time. These mostly white dudes ask, how can we make sense of space and time as human beings? Knowledge. How do objective and subjective knowledge interrelate in shared institutions? Now, in this summary you will see the questions of race, justice, social exclusion, and meaningful inclusion don't get discussed. But Ahmed's argument is that they could be. That is where we find the work of Ahmed and her fellow travelers, who I'll discuss in the next video. So that should give you a taste of classical phenomenology. Next, I want to show you how Ahmed is trying to work within that tradition. I want to end this video giving you a sneak peek of how Ahmed tries to reorient classical phenomenology. Keep the following things in mind as you do the readings. First, classical philosophical work in phenomenology was mostly done by old white guys who wanted to know what man's world was like. This is not Ahmed's project. She wants to rework the institution to talk about race and other identities. Secondly, exclusion and oppression. With a focus on exclusion and meaning, Ahmed wants us to see how exclusion is more than a question of who is in and who is out. She wants to talk about how we feel included and excluded meaningfully. How do we feel racism, sexism, or ableism in our bones? This is a Sara Ahmed question. Finally, and this is a bit of a departure from the work in the sociology of race and ethnicity we've read so far, Ahmed's approach puts meaning first, before material exclusion. Remember, Du Bois wanted to look at the history of racial exclusion in the United States in the reading I assigned. This was his later, more Marxist work. Ahmed, by contrast, is more interested in how we dwell within the color line, closer to his earlier work. Do we see the difference? And again, for P.H. Collins, she is interested in recovering an ignored black feminist tradition. Ahmed, by contrast, wants to look at how it feels to be ignored by people, and by institutions within which they dwell. That's it for me. When you're going through the readings, think about racialization, institutions, and meaning. I'll see you in the next video.